Hello, my name's Julian Edgar and I'm the author of the book Modifying the Aerodynamics of Your Road Car. What I want to do in today's video is talk about how you get most air through a front mounted heat exchanger. Now typically that'll be a radiator, but could also be an intercooler, could also be an oil cooler. We'll talk about it being a radiator in today's video just to make it easier to refer to. So up on the whiteboard I've done a representation of a car. We've got the shape of the car, and at the front we've got the radiator that's been mounted. Now we need outside air to pass through. You only get airflow if the pressure on one side is greater than the pressure on the other side. So let's draw the air coming towards the car, or the car coming towards the air. It doesn't make any difference which way you think about it. And we're going to try to get as much of that air through the radiator as possible. At the front, the pressure is high as the air comes to bear on the front part of the radiator. We therefore want the pressure behind the radiator to be as low as possible. Now let's imagine the engine bay is completely sealed, no openings except for that front mounted radiator. The airflow will flow through the radiator, it'll build up in the engine bay, the pressure in the engine bay will rise. When the pressure here is the same as the pressure there, no airflow will flow through the radiator. Therefore, we need ways of getting air out from behind the heat exchanger. That's more important than getting outside air to the front of the radiator. Everyone already knows about that. How do you get the air away from behind the radiator? Now in most cars there are openings and that air can flow out through the bottom of the engine bay. So the next question becomes, how low is the pressure under the car? If the pressure under the car is high, not much air will flow out under the car. Therefore, you won't get a good pressure difference across the radiator. How do we decrease the pressure under the car? There's two primary ways. One, often used on older cars, is to put a front spoiler to stop air passing under the car. The pressure under the car is lower, air is encouraged to come out of the engine bay. But the trouble with that is that air that no longer goes under the car has to go over the car and around the car. That can increase drag, that can increase lift if in fact that air is coming to bear over curved upper surfaces. So on modern cars that's an approach that's typically not taken. Instead, in fact, it's almost the opposite. You encourage as much air to come under the car as possible, but to do that you need a smooth under tray under the car. You then get a high speed airflow under the car. Higher speed equals lower pressure. You end up with a lower pressure under the car. More air is drawn out of the engine bay. So air that goes out of the engine bay and under the car lowers the pressure in the engine bay, and therefore the pressure difference across the radiator is higher. Are there other ways of doing it? Yes, there are. You can put bonnet vents, hood vents, that allow the air to come out that way. Now, in the practical world, that's got a few disadvantages. One is that your intake air system for your cabin ventilation is going to be breathing hotter air. So if you live in a hot climate, that's not so good. The other potential negative of that approach is you need to have holes in your bonnet, you need to have holes in your hood, you need to have big openings to let all that air out. There is another way that air can exit the engine bay, and that is it can come out around the wheel wells, come out through the wheel wells. And if you look at a lot of modern cars, the inside the engine bay, you'll see that while there's room for drive shafts potentially in a front wheel drive or an all-wheel drive car and steering arms, that there's openings to let those through, but there's also often much bigger openings because they're letting quite a proportion, the designers are letting quite a proportion of air come out through the wheel wells. So another way of lowering the pressure in the engine bay is to actually create openings that allow air to flow out past the wheels. So when we're talking about improving the efficiency of a front mount heat exchanger, radiator for example, most of the effort needs to be spent in lowering the pressure in the engine bay, so getting air out of the engine bay, which then causes a greater pressure differential across the radiator. More air will then flow through. People will talk about sealing gaps around the radiator, using foam strips, and that's a good approach. If you spray paint the foam black, you won't even see it, and it will conform to all the different shapes, so it doesn't even have to be cut all that accurately. But in the real world, the greatest aerodynamic improvement by far in improving front mount heat exchanger efficiency is to get the air out of the engine bay and so lower the pressure there. it's not just guesswork. You can actually measure those pressures. You can measure those pressures quite cheaply. In my book, Modifying the Aerodynamics of Your Road Car, I actually show how to measure those pressures directly as you drive down the road. You can then assess the effectiveness of things like a front spoiler if you want to take that particular route, or an air dam. You can assess the effectiveness of openings that you place in the bonnet or hood and so on. So you can actually measure what I'm describing. It's not just guesstimates or rules of thumb. The book's called Modifying the Aerodynamics of Your Road Car, and it's out now. Thank you.